let's start with the big one. What if? What if the most influential book in Western history just, poof, vanish overnight? Imagine a world completely untouched by the Bible. No familiar stories, no guiding principles we often take for granted, none of that artistic inspiration.
Right.
Just think about the scale of that absence for a second.
It's a huge thought experiment, isn't it? Because the Bible, it's not just scripture for believers. It's this foundational text.
Absolutely.
It has profoundly shaped civilization in so many ways we probably don't even consciously recognize day to day. So our mission is to explore that huge impact. We want to trace those lines of influence, across history, culture, law, ethics, art, belief systems.
Using the material we've looked at.
Exactly. Using our sources to understand just how deeply this collection of writings is, embedded in the world we know.
Embedded feels like an understatement, honestly. It's like trying to picture a river without its source, isn't it?
That's a good way to put it.
And as we get into this, it's crucial to remember, like you said, all these areas, religion, politics, culture, they're not separate boxes. They're all tangled up.
Completely interconnected. One thing affects another.
So let's start with the most obvious place, perhaps, the religious landscape itself. Okay, where do we begin unpacking this?
Indeed. Without the Bible, the religious map of the world,
Right.
it would be almost unrecognizable.
Right.
Christianity, certainly as we understand it, simply wouldn't have emerged. The New Testament is the bedrock.
No New Testament, no Christianity as we know it.
Exactly. And our sources really emphasize this, that single absence kicks off this massive chain reaction. No Roman Catholic Church developing in the way it did.
And therefore, no Protestant Reformation either.
Precisely. Two absolutely pivotal movements that fundamentally reshaped Western history. Just gone.
Those are seismic shifts. The consequences are almost unimaginable. And it's not just Christianity, is it? What about Judaism?
That's a really important point. The Hebrew Bible, Tanakh, obviously exists independently. But our sources suggest that without the New Testament, the whole historical relationship between Judaism and what became Christianity would be drastically different.
How so?
Well, for starters, the centuries of interaction, conflict, and dialogue wouldn't exist in that form. And internally within Judaism, it likely would have shifted the ongoing discussions and interpretations around messianic beliefs.
Interesting. Okay, so Judaism is altered. What about Islam?
Right. Broadening the view again. The Quran is, of course, the central text for Islam, but it explicitly acknowledges many figures and narratives from the Bible, particularly the Old Testament prophets.
Abraham, Moses, Jesus.
Exactly. So the sources we looked at suggest that without that preceding biblical tradition already established, the very development of Islamic theology could have taken a significantly different path.
It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Would these major world religions bear any resemblance to what we know?
It's fascinating. And what fills that spiritual vacuum? Do entirely new belief systems pop up?
Or do existing ones, maybe ancient pagan traditions or philosophical schools, evolve in completely unforeseen directions?
Yeah, it's like hitting a massive reset button on humanity's spiritual journey.
Okay, so the religious side is drastically different. Now, this is where it gets really interesting for me. How does this absence play out in, say, politics and law?
Absolutely. The influence there is significant, though maybe less direct sometimes. Think about Western legal traditions.
Okay.
Our sources point to things like, the Ten Commandments. They offer this early, widely known articulation of certain core principles, prohibitions against theft, murder, false witness.
Ideas that resonate in legal systems globally, really.
They do. And while other cultures had laws, this specific formulation had a huge impact in the West. Without it, our sources suggest legal frameworks might have leaned more heavily on, say, Greco-Roman traditions.
Focusing maybe on different aspects of social order or individual responsibility.
Perhaps different moral frameworks shaping the very definition of crime and justice.
So the core concepts of what's right, wrong, and punishable could have developed along entirely different lines. And that impact would just be domestic law.
No.
Definitely not. Our material really highlights the role the Bible played in European colonization, the whole missionary aspect.
Yes, that's a critical point in the sources. The intertwining of religious belief, spread in the gospel, and imperial ambition. It's undeniable.
So without the Bible as that primary justification or motivation for missionary work,
the whole character of European expansion could have been fundamentally different. The interactions with indigenous peoples, the justifications used, even the forms of resistance to it all, potentially altered.
wow, it really makes you reconsider huge chunks of global history.
It does. And zooming in from those large-scale forces, our sources also talk about the impact on our basic understanding of ethics.
Yeah, things like justice, but also concepts like covenant or the inherent dignity of the individual.
Exactly. These ideas are so deeply rooted in biblical narratives, aren't they? The creation story, the Exodus, the parables.
So this raises a pretty fundamental question about things like human rights then.
It does.
Yeah.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, these biblical ideas, they've profoundly informed our Western understanding of social responsibility, the value placed on human life.
So without them, maybe the journey towards recognizing universal human rights might have been slower or taken a very different path.
It's certainly possible. It could have led to different conceptions of crime, punishment, social welfare, even human worth itself. Now, if we shift gears a bit, let's look at culture and literature. The absence here is just stark.
Oh, absolutely stark. I mean, just try to imagine Western art, music, literature without the Bible. Think of, well, Dante, Milton, Bach, Handel, Rembrandt, Michelangelo. The list is endless.
It really is. Our sources hammer this home. So many foundational works simply wouldn't exist, or if they did, they'd be drawing on entirely different myths, legends, histories.
Different sources of inspiration altogether. Maybe more classical myths or local folk traditions.
Could be. And what's fascinating isn't just losing specific masterpieces, but the knock-on effect. Biblical stories provided this, like shared toolkit of themes, characters, allegories for centuries.
A common language for artists.
Exactly. Without that bedrock, the whole evolution of Western art would look profoundly different. Different movements, different conventions, maybe entirely different cultural touchstones that we'd recognize today.
And it's not just the high art, is it? Our sources mention language itself.
Yes. That's such a subtle but pervasive influence. So many common English idioms.
Like the salt of the earth, or a drop in the bucket writing on the wall.
By the skin of your teeth, a thorn in the flesh, the powers that be. They come directly from early English Bible translations, like the King James Version.
It's almost invisible, woven right into how we talk.
Completely. And if we think bigger, losing these phrases isn't just about vocabulary, it reflects a shift in how we conceptualize things.
How we communicate shared ideas or experiences.
Right. The Bible provided this huge reservoir of shared cultural references. Take that away, and there's a significant void. It makes you wonder, how else would our languages have evolved to fill that gap?
That's a really interesting thought. Okay, so that leads us quite naturally into philosophy and ethics, doesn't it? Building on law and culture.
It does. And our sources highlight just how much Western ethical thought, even secular thought, owes to core biblical teachings.
Concepts like charity, forgiveness, the pursuit of justice, you see them echoed everywhere.
Absolutely. And it makes you wonder, would these specific values have gained the same prominence? Would they have developed in quite the same way without that biblical emphasis?
It's tricky because moral reasoning exists everywhere, but
this specific shape and weight given to these particular virtues in Western culture, that's been significantly influenced by biblical narratives. Think about ideas like the sanctity of life or the inherent equality of all people.
Often linked back to biblical ideas about creation, everyone made in God's image, that sort of thing.
Exactly. Without that specific grounding, those concepts might have emerged differently, maybe through purely philosophical routes, maybe linked to other traditions, or perhaps just taken much longer to become widely accepted ideals.
And it's not just abstract philosophy, is it? The material we looked at reminds us how many real-world social and political movements drew directly on the Bible.
Oh, massively. Think about the abolitionist movement against slavery.
Yes, citing Exodus, ideas of liberation.
Or the civil rights movement in the U.S.
Yeah.
Dr. King's speeches are saturated with biblical language and concepts of justice.
Right. That moral authority was crucial.
Absolutely crucial. So if you connect that to the bigger picture, think about the role of churches and other religious institutions often centered on biblical teachings in community organizing, in advocating for change.
That whole infrastructure of social action would look different.
Drastically different, which raises a huge question. How would those pivotal movements for social justice have unfolded? Would they have even taken the same form without that powerful moral and, frankly, spiritual foundation?
It's hard to imagine them having the same impact.
It really is. And furthermore, our sources touch on how biblical ideas about, say, governance, leadership, the individual's relationship with authority, how those have filtered into political thought over centuries.
Concepts of covenant, limits on power, individual conscience.
All arguably influenced by that tradition. It's a fascinating exercise to imagine the alternative political theories that might have dominated.
Okay, let's shift again, maybe to an area that seems less obviously connected at first: science and education.
Right, but the historical links are surprisingly strong. What's really interesting is the role religious institutions played in founding the earliest universities in Europe.
Oxford, Cambridge, the Sorbonne.
Many were initially set up primarily to educate clergy. And what did the clergy need to do? Read and interpret the Bible.
So the Bible was a direct driver for higher education infrastructure.
In many cases, yes. And similarly, think about mass literacy. Many early movements to teach ordinary people to read were driven by the desire for them to read the scriptures for themselves. The Reformation played a big part there, too.
Print the Bible in the vernacular, teach people to read it.
Exactly. Without that specific religious impetus, how does the spread of education look? Does it happen as quickly? Is it prioritized in the same way?
The whole structure and maybe the core values of education systems might look radically different.
It's very possible. And then there's the complex relationship between science and religion.
Yeah, often portrayed as pure conflict, but the sources show it's more nuanced.
Much more nuanced. Many historical tensions, yes, but also collaborations and dialogues often revolved around interpreting the Bible in light of new discoveries, or vice versa.
Like debates over cosmology, geology, biology.
Precisely. So if you consider the implications, maybe scientific inquiry might have been less constrained in certain areas without specific theological objections rooted in biblical interpretation.
Fewer hurdles, perhaps.
Perhaps. But it's also worth asking, would the pursuit of knowledge itself, that early natural philosophy, have been as motivated or directed in certain ways without the initial framework provided by religious scholarship, which was often Bible-focused?
A different kind of inspiration or lack thereof?
It's a really complex interplay.
Yeah.
Our sources also just reiterate that centrality of Bible study in early Western education. It emphasized literacy, textual analysis, interpretation, skills valuable far beyond theology.
So while education would surely exist in a world without the Bible, its path, its structure, maybe who even got access to it, could have been profoundly different.
Absolutely. Okay, finally, let's just briefly touch on the global ramifications.
Because this isn't just a Western story, is it?
Not at all, especially considering history from the last 500 years or so. The global religious map would be almost entirely unrecognizable without the historical spread of Christianity.
Driven by missionaries, often alongside colonization.
Yes. To the Americas, large parts of Africa, Asia. Our sources emphasize that countless cultural and political shifts, movements, and institutions across the globe are directly linked to those Christian missions and the Bible they brought.
So without the Bible driving that specific form of expansion,
those encounters, conversions, conflicts, and cultural syntheses just wouldn't have happened in the same way, or maybe at all in some places.
think of the sheer scale of that. Entire continents with potentially vastly different dominant religions, cultures, political alignments. It really underscores the Bible's role as a truly global force.
It really does. To sort of reiterate, the absence of the Bible isn't some minor tweak to history.
No.
It would have these profound, far-reaching consequences. A massive ripple effect across almost every single facet of human civilization as we know it.
So just to sum up then, we're talking about a fundamentally different religious and philosophical landscape.
Complete change.
Drastically altered legal, moral, political systems.
Unrecognizable in many ways.
A wildly different history of global interaction, colonization, culture.
Yeah, a different world map.
And this massive divergence in art, language, science, and education. It really is like pulling the keystone out of an arch, isn't it?
That's a perfect analogy.
Yeah.
The whole structure becomes unstable, shifts, and ultimately looks completely different.
Yeah.
And really compels you to think, doesn't it? What other foundational texts or maybe core ideas have shaped our world so deeply, often in ways we don't even notice?
Right.
What other seemingly indispensable pillars of our civilization, if you hypothetically remove them, would lead to just such unimaginable transformations? It's a powerful reminder, I think, of just how interconnected human history is and the enduring power of the stories and ideas we build our worlds upon.